It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by SubashTechnosis.com. Check out Subash Technosis on Facebook, Subash Technosis LLC. If you need any kind of website design, search engine optimization, to monetize your YouTube channel and get your YouTube views and hits up and your revenue up on YouTube, content writing, press releases, data entry, even customer service. They can handle your customer service phone calls for you. SubashTechnosis.com. I've been dealing with Subash for over 10 years, so when you call them up or you go to their website, mention Ed Opperman. You'll get a good deal. All right. I'm very excited today. We got Jack Cashill. You can find his website at Cashill.com. Written about 7 or 8 books. Today we're going to be talking about TWA 800, the crash, the cover-up, and the conspiracy. But he's got a great library of books there on Ron Brown, on George Zimmerman. A lot of topics we cover here all the time. And also, too, I know a lot of people who listen to the show, they run right out and they buy the book right away. He's written several books on TWA 800. He's been working on this a long time. So check it out on Amazon before you just grab one book. Try and grab the whole package. So Jack Cashill, are you there?
Hey, I am here, Ed, and thanks for having me on the show.
Hey, what are you from? Out west, or?
Actually, I live in Kansas City, but I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, actually. So it's I've been moving across the country for the last bunch of years and settled in the middle.
Yeah, I grew up in Staten Island. Then I moved to. I live in Nevada now, so I'm pretty much doing the same.
Yeah, I could hear this. I could hear the Staten Island in your voice, by the way. And Staten Island was the only New York borough to vote for Trump.
So. Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'm not surprised by that at all. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who's Jack Cashill?
Well, I like I said, I grew up in Newark. My father was a cop, and I went to as I was coming up, I was really in that period I was really undetermined as to what I wanted to be. Eventually, I wanted to be a writer, but when I was trying to break in, there were, and this is relevant to the story at hand, there were far, far fewer points of access. So there were only 3 broadcast networks, and there's only a couple major newspapers. And unless you were wired, unless you had good connections, you were going to be, writing about, bowling leagues in Albany probably for the rest of your career. So I went to graduate school instead at Purdue and met my wife there. We moved to Kansas City. And then eventually, once the internet blossomed, I found my way back into reporting and writing because I could do it. Right now, I have as much reportorial power as the New York Times, and I have an advantage over the Times, and that is I don't have to ask anyone permission. I'm not going to get my stories edited 2 or 3 levels up by people who have an agenda and don't like the truth that's coming out of me. So I've actually written in the last, since 2000, I've had a dozen books published. I've done 10 book TVs. And I've also, collaborated quietly with other name authors on probably 10 or 12 other books.
Yeah, that's so true. We have the freedom, working for ourselves, got that freedom, to get the truth out.
Yep.
But do you ever get nervous? Have you had any kind of harassment or any kind of threats or anything?
That's a good question. I get asked that often. I would say the answer is really no. And the reason is that, I don't have any firsthand information.
Right.
So there's nothing I know that isn't in print someplace or online, So if the last thing I think the people in authority would want to do is to call attention to me, So I feel I've never felt particularly worried. I've been, yelled at and I've been harassed, and anyone who speaks publicly gets thousands of hateful emails and whatnot, but that's just par for the course. I've never felt, I had a female stalker once. That was a little scary, but she was a fan. Why worry more about the fans than the enemies? So
yeah, that's so true. So let's start with the official story, and then we'll get to the truth. What's the official story of what happened with TWA 800?
Well, after 4 years of investigation, the crash, by the way, took place in 1996, July 17th, and that date has a lot to do with what would happen afterwards. 4 years later, in August of 2000, the National Transportation Safety Board finally concluded that a spark of mysterious origin, of undetermined origin, set off fumes in the central fuel tank of the 747, TWA Flight 800, for the first time in the history of commercial aviation that happened, and the last time, and blew the 747 out of the sky, killing all 230 people on board. The media absolutely refused to even question the verdict, and that speaks to a topic much in the news today, that is fake news. The fact of the matter is that some of the great fake news stories I'm responsible for, and they are anything but fake, and the media have done their best to preserve the real fraudulent, the counterfeit stories, and pass them off as truth.
Yeah, how do you think that works? Because we're watching today this thing about this Pizzagate, this Comet Pizza.
Right.
How is it that they're able to all of them, like all of the news, just to make this blanket statement with no reference to what's the pictures we've seen going on in that place, no reference to any of the accusations against these people, and just dismiss it? Well, it's all fake, 100% fake, with no investigation.
They do that all the time. They don't even look at the evidence. They don't bother with the evidence. Why bother with the evidence if the evidence is inconvenient? The New York Times has mastered this, and the New York Times is largely responsible for the scandal, for the misdirection of the TWA 800 investigation.
Right.
So what happened on that night? Well, several things happened. What triggered the alarm in Washington, and I've talked to the air traffic controllers who saw it in Westbury rather, on Long Island, and Tracon there. The one guy told me, he says, listen, I saw this unknown object, sending vertically and intersecting TWA Flight 800. The plane disappears from the screen. They immediately contacted Washington. Now, the FAA offices in Washington, at that point, this was on 8:30 at night on July 17th, perfectly beautiful night, not a cloud in the sky. What they did not know at that time was that, at least 258 people would tell the FBI that they saw what appeared to be a missile ascending off the horizon, zigzagging up, arcing over, and then destroying TWA Flight 800. Now, where the fake news comes in is that the New York Times, how many of those 258 people the New York Times interviewed?
How many? Zero.
Zero. Zero. Not a single one of them.
Yeah.
And these people were professionals. A lot of them are military people, fishermen, sailors. People who are used to looking at the sea. People who know something about bearings and and directional and have their own GPSs and whatnot. None of them. The New York Times just went right along with what they were fed, and the real motivation behind both the cover-up, and there's no better word for it, and the New York Times complicity in that cover-up was the fact that this happened in 1996 in July. It happened the month before the Democratic National Convention. Clinton was running for re-election, and even though by this time he had it pretty well under control, after the November 1994 debacle in which the Democrats lost the Senate and the House thanks to the Clinton incompetence and overreach, the media panicked. And the Clintons did too. Well, the Clintons just went on this reckless, criminal fundraising campaign, much of the money coming from foreign governments overseas. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And the media was like horrified that Newt Gingrich was now the Speaker of the House. And that's when the turning point to me was in 1994, November. But they didn't count on something else happening. And that is the emergence of the Internet. When TWA Flight 800 went down in July 96, only 10% of the American people were online. And had it been just 5 years later, there's no way in the world they could have gotten away with that. because so many people would have been posting their videos, and they would have been talking to each other.
Oh yeah, right. Imagine if everybody had those cell phone cameras like we do now.
Yeah, right. You didn't even need the cameras; they just needed to talk to each other. At the time, since the media were not reporting about the witnesses, all the witnesses thought they were crazy. Thought they were. Did I see that? Was I the only one who saw that? Little did they know that the FBI was out talking to all these people. They would eventually record 258 formal eyewitnesses who saw a missile. Now, several hundred others just saw the tail end of the explosion, and literally, I'm sure thousands more saw it and chose not to speak to the FBI, or the FBI didn't find their way to them. But they had 258 formal eyewitnesses, and they all told the same story. And then that story backed up what the air traffic controllers saw.
I lived in New York City back in '96. I remember the local coverage on the news. Now, am I crazy, or in the first couple of days, weren't they showing a video there was like a home video of the rocket going up?
You're not crazy.
Yeah, I'm not crazy.
What happened was, is to my best information, MSNBC, which had been on the air for 2 days at the time, and had not yet found its identity, obviously, won a bidding war for an amateur video. They showed it a few times that night. Now, the person... I know a person who's working at MSNBC. He will not speak to me on the record, but he's spoken to a go-between who I trust totally and who has no business in misinforming me. He said he was there that night. They were running the video, and the FBI came in and confiscated and threatened them with who knows what kind of retaliation if they ever talked about it. Now, what happened, my best source on this video is a 747 pilot who was laid up in a Hong Kong hospital at that time having back surgery. His wife had come to visit him, so they were there together all the time. He said they showed it endlessly in Hong Kong. He said he saw it 20, 30, 40, 50 times. And he knows what he was seeing. And he described it the way, people milling about on the deck, blah, blah, blah. Someone said, oh, look, let's take a fireworks. And then they follow it, and you see the whole sequence. I don't doubt that it's there. Nelson DeMille wrote his novel Nightfall around that missing video, and he was alerted to it by the NYPD. So, yeah, it's out there. It's been suppressed. We had, however, for this book, in fact, only within a year did we find this, the FBI released something almost as damning, and that was a video shot 5 days prior from the south coast of Long Island, of a missile test in the Atlantic. It's clearly a test. We see the missile going up. The amateur videographer says, oh, it looks like a missile. It looks like a rocket. Well, it was. And then we see some flaming debris falling down. This is 5 days before the crash. What makes this interesting is that the FBI said there had been no missile tests in that area for at least 2 years, and they were not telling the truth. There had also been multiple accounts of a witness of a missile test on July 7th. So you have a test on July 7th, July 12th. You have a shoot down on July 17th. You don't have to be a math major to see the sequence here. They were testing missiles every 5 days off the coast of Long Island, and this one got in the way.
And it was a naval reserve ship that was doing these tests, right?
It was, I would tell you with 100% confidence that a missile took out, or missiles took out the airplane.
Right.
98% confidence that the Navy was responsible. Our Navy.
One other odd thing, too. I wonder if you ran across this, because it seemed very odd to me at the time when I was watching this on the news, that they took all the family members and they put them up in a hotel. They put them all up in the same hotel nearby. And some of them were there like for a month or even more than a month. Is that right?
Pretty much true. It was the Ramada Inn, and they called it Heartbreak Hotel, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
The reason why people stayed is because, and I've talked to many of the family members who were there, and it had to be just a agonizing place to be, but they didn't want to go until their loved one's body was identified.
Right.
And that wasn't necessarily easy because with the missile strike, with the place where the missile hit particularly, it just atomized the bodies. It demolished them, catastrophically. If it was a mere fuel tank fire, not mere, but then people are going to be burned. It's going to be horrible, but they're going to be recognizable. It'd be easy to, they'll be individually, there'll be individual bodies rather than in some cases where bodies were fused together and they only had just, the slightest DNA strands to compare.
Let me ask you another question I've always wanted to ask somebody who's investigated this. I heard a story because my buddies were the NYPD Harbor Aviation guys who actually brought up debris from there, okay? The best man at my wedding. These are people I know very well.
Right.
And they told me this wacky story that someone showed up at the scene and declared he was in charge of things, and he had a helipad built. And then they found out that he didn't have any real credentials. Did you ever hear anything about that story?
No, I have not, but I don't doubt it. There's so much weird stuff going on.
Okay, all right.
And you're right. If you've been out on Long Island, every other person on Long Island has some connection to this.
Oh, really?
Because so many people were involved in the rescue and recovery and investigation, the rehabilitation of the plane, et cetera. So, yeah, I every time I do a show like this, Ed, I'll get a dozen emails from people saying, hey, I was there, I know something, And I've been able to piece it together little by little. And I've learned almost as much after the book came out in July than I have before, Not almost as much, but I've learned a good deal.
So now, how soon did the cover-up start?
It started immediately, but it was improvisational. Here's what I know for sure. One of my best supporters is a fellow named Vern Gross, who is had been a member of the National Transportation Safety Board. I should say there's only 5 people on the National Transportation Safety, the board. So it's a very powerful position. And Gross was a Reagan-era appointee, but he was probably the most knowledgeable person in the country on plane crashes. So CNN called him in that night to do on-air commentary. He said he was there for 6 straight hours. He could barely take a bathroom break. He said, but while he was still on the air, and so now we're talking, before 3 or 4 a.m., the FBI had already taken over the investigation. This is illegal. National Transportation Safety Board was set up to, to give a certain independence to these kind of investigations, and for good reason. Because the FBI reports to the Justice Department, and we've seen how that goes, just in the last few months.
Yeah.
Now, but what Vernon Gross did not know at the time, which really none of us did until we unearthed this treasure trove of CIA documents within the last year. And that's what makes my new book so, I would say, so vital in terms of new information. We know now everything the CIA was up to. On day one, they announced, they admit in their memos, these inter-office memos that we've seized, that they had involved themselves in investigation, which was doubly illegal. Because not only had they no business with the investigation, a domestic airline investigation, but according to the famous Wall memo, which had been authorized the year before by the Clinton DOJ, they weren't allowed to communicate with the FBI on criminal or intelligence issues. They had to keep their own separate provinces. But they ignored that right away. And their only role of the CIA from day one, and it's evident, and when you read their documents, was to make all talk of missiles go away. So on July 30th, now we're 13 days after the crash, the CIA analyst sends a press release, sends a memo to his superior, and the names are redacted. I know who the analyst was. And it says, it's titled, Hold the Presses. The analyst, CIA guy, has just met with the FBI missile team. It's a 2 or 3 man team. And I've identified the head of that team after my book came out. And the missile team told them they had already interviewed 144 excellent eyewitnesses to a surface-to-air missile strike on TWA Flight 800. These witnesses were, quote, mainly professional. They were excellent. They were totally consistent, too consistent for it to be anything but a missile. And the FBI was ready to go forward with this report. This was 2 weeks after the crash. That's how much they knew. And I don't doubt that this is true because the FBI started the interviews immediately, and they did them in good faith initially, even though they didn't really have they weren't very sophisticated about how they went about it. Well, the CIA guy says to his superior, he brags to him, I discouraged him from going forward with this report, blah, blah, blah. And he was right, because by the first time the New York Times talks about eyewitnesses, and that's just 2 weeks after that, and around mid-August, the 144 eyewitnesses, excellent eyewitnesses, have been dwindled down to fewer, it is a quote, than a dozen credible eyewitnesses, the most credible of which the New York Times was allowed to speak with. And he was a good eyewitness, it's just he didn't see anything. He just turned his head at the last second and saw what he thought was a bomb, because there's a bright white explosion, a high explosion, destroying the airplane. And so they takeaway message from the New York Times, which, the New York Times spoke, the FBI spoke almost exclusively to the New York Times. The takeaway message from their interview with the FBI was that there are fewer than a dozen witnesses. The best eyewitnesses believe they saw a bomb, and they just essentially took missiles off the table.
Now, let's back up just a little bit. You mentioned that there were other missile tests back there, right?
Yeah.
Is it sanctioned to be able to? Is there enough space back there to be doing missile tests?
Well, obviously not. There was, the TWA 800 just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and part of the problem, it would have been avoidable had they been better coordinated, because the air traffic control kept Flight 800 down around 12 or 13,000 feet. They should have been up higher, but it was a plane crossing overhead, so they kept them at a lower altitude. Now, let me tell you about one of the better eyewitnesses, probably the best. This is witness number 73. She's a travel professional with an interest in aviation. She's following Flight 800 across the sky, and she comments to her friends who are with her, well, that plane's awfully low, being 12 minutes out of JFK. And then she watches, she sees Flight 800, then she sees another object. This one comes up off the horizon, and like everyone else, she says that a burning red tip and a smoky white or gray contrail, arcs out to sea, zigzags, disappears for a second, arcs over. Then she said it arced over like an upside-down Nike swoosh, hit the plane at the right wing or at or near the right wing. Boom, boom, bright white explosions. Bam, big orange fireball. The nose of the plane is severed. It falls independently into the sea. Then the plane falls, the rest of the plane, the fuselage falls, breaks into two and falls into the sea. Well, they interviewed her, the FBI interviewed her 3 days after the crash at her home in North Carolina. And she had just given them the precise breakup sequence of the airplane. It would take the FBI a few weeks to verify from the debris field that what she said was true. That's how well she saw it. Now, that was a problem for the FBI, but not for the CIA. The CIA knew it had a problem on its hand, so they went about solving it. And this is a kind of fascinating detail. You have to really get into the weeds to see how it works. By January 1st, the CIA had been imposing its theory on the crash, that it was a fuel tank explosion, blew the nose off the plane, and then the plane, with that noseless airplane, turned upright and rocketed into space for another 4,000 feet, confusing people into thinking they saw a missile. Now, they hadn't gone public with this yet, but privately everyone sort of signed on to it. It was, of course, aerodynamically absurd, and every pilot knows that, would tell you that. But the one guy on the FBI missile team refused to buckle. And so on April 29, 1997, and this we learned from the CIA documents, and his name's Steve Bongard. He's since contacted me. He's a good guy. He confronts the CIA, and he says, listen, there are at least 30 problem eyewitnesses. At least 30 people saw the plane coming in the opposite direction from TWA 800, so it couldn't have been the plane in crippled flight unless it just changed directions. He said at least 8 people saw the plane, the missile hit the airplane, He goes, and your aerodynamics are crazy. He goes, the radar data doesn't match what you're saying. You really need to go back to the drawing board and do this over, On that same day, April 29th, 1997, Steve Bongard, and I doubt if he knew this, at least the sort of spook version of Steve Bongard shows up in North Carolina, and now he's interviewing witness number 73 again. And now witness 73 is telling Steve Bungard that, she'd been drinking Long Island iced teas before the crash. She wasn't quite sure what she saw, blah, 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 right? So, I would say 13, I can tell you, it's 2009, 13 years after the crash, out of the blue, witness number 73 calls me,
Yeah.
And she knew she'd read my earlier book and found her way to me. And she said, I just wanted to talk to you about, my eyewitness statements. I said, yeah, I'm curious about that second witness statement you did in April '97 and why you changed your story. She goes, well, that's what I wanted to talk about. She goes, I don't even know what a Long Island iced tea is. And I said, could it have been another drink? And it's a cocktail, by the way, Long Island iced tea cocktails, but it's in the report. I said, could it have been another drink? She goes, no, because she goes, I don't drink. And then she said, there's something else you need to know. I said, what's that? She goes, there was no second interview.
Wow.
And then I said, there's something you need to know. She goes, what's that? You're not alone.
Wow.
What the CIA did was they went back into the record. I could prove this easily, and created new witness statements for several key eyewitnesses to negate the effect of their first ones. And then in this case, they put Bungard's name on the witness, on the witness statement, probably just to tie his hands. In fact, he just contacted me about a week before the election. So we have some talking to do.
Let me ask you a couple of questions now. Okay, and I believe the theory that it's the Naval Reserve vessel that why would the CIA and the FBI be covering up for a Navy mistake, an honest mistake?
Well, this comes out of the top. This comes out of the White House, As it is, the people say, how can so many people keep their mouths shut? Oh. There's not many people who really knew what was going on. And it was done in an improvisational way. The investigation was highly compartmentalized. I am sure that the message that went to the CIA and all parties in the FBI, the Navy, maybe even the Navy, was that this was a test of with a high national security quotient. That we could not afford to have this revealed to the public that they went awry. If it was those people who knew it went awry, other people were told it was an Iranian. Right. That was the word that Clinton was putting out privately, was that it was an Iranian missile strike. So they were probably getting this message that for national security reasons, we can absolutely not talk about missiles. This was, by the way, 2 days before the start of the Atlanta Olympics. If we thought a terrorist was shooting planes out of the sky, we'd probably had to scuttle the Olympics. Clinton is running on a peace and prosperity message. If this were a terrorist missile, there'd be no peace or no prosperity. Clinton's Achilles heel was his commander-in-chief. If it was an accident, it's going to reflect very badly on him. And it could be the one wrench that derails his re-election bid. So I'm sure there were different motives for different people. The insiders knew it was political. The other people who collaborated probably did not. But there's no denying the political nature of this cover-up.
Yeah, I heard you mention in another interview or maybe a presentation that you did that there was a 3 a.m. memo that evening by Clinton.
And there was apparently a 3 a.m. phone call.
Okay.
That went to Tony Lake from the White House. Here's what I know. I know that from Hillary's logs that she and her husband returned to the White House at 8:30 that night, just about the time the plane was blowing up. I mean, they didn't know about it, but they're just coincidental. They were at some local fundraiser. They go up to the family quarters. Leon Panetta, according to his, himself, says that he alerted the Clintons at 9 o'clock, which is probably makes sense. Richard Clark says that at the 9 o'clock he called an emergency meeting in the for the anti-terror group, which is an unusual thing to do for a domestic plane crash, first time ever. And then I have a very good source in the White House. I can't get into names here, but who is as close to the president as it could possibly be, who says that the Clintons didn't go down to the Situation Room with the other people. They stayed in the family quarters with one other person, and that person was the deputy national security advisor, Sandy Berger. Now, Tony Lake was the national security advisor. He was Berger's boss. And Lake has said elsewhere that when the conversation got political, he left the room because Berger was the political guy. So according to my source, those were the only three people in the family quarters that night. At 3 o'clock, Tony Lake got the call from the Clinton to and what he said was dust off the contingency plans. And the contingency plans meant retaliation against Iran. And that's where that stood. And I know from other interviews that Clinton gave at that time, one with Taylor Branch, a historian that was not revealed for another 10 years, was that he was telling Branch that it was likely a missile attack by Iran. That was about a week or 10 days after the crash. That was the word I'm sure he was spreading locally to keep people at ease, off balance, and to justify the cover-up. Because if they thought, let's say if they only merely thought Iran had done this, but couldn't prove Iran had done this, the notion of retaliating against Iran without firm evidence, there's good reason not to,
I tell you, I've been wanting to do a TWA 800 show for a while. As a matter of fact, I had an attorney on. I forget his name right now, but he sued and he won in the case. I think his name was Clark, right? John Clark?
John Clark, yeah, right. John's a good friend.
Yeah. Oh, he's great. I love him.
Yeah.
But I tell you, Jack, you're my new friend because I love you. Because I love the way you know every little detail. Like it's right at the tip of your fingertips. I got a guy that knows the story backwards and forwards for years and years. I'm going to take a commercial break. We're with Jack Cashill. The latest book is TWA 800, The Crash, The Cover-Up, and The Conspiracy. We'll be right back after these messages. You can find Jack at his website, Cashill.com. And we'll be right back after this. And now a word from our sponsors. Did you know that 30% of all people on online dating websites and personal ads are either married or in a monogamous relationship? 30%. If you suspect that your husband, your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend may be cheating online, go to emailrevealer.com. At our online infidelity investigation. You give us their email address, and we can trace it back to online personal ads, dating sites, and social networks. We can even expand the investigation and find them cheating on escort service sites or even porn sites if they're registered to porn sites and swinger sites. So check out emailrevealer.com if you suspect your spouse is cheating, and check out our online infidelity investigation. William Ramsey is a producer here at the Opperman Report, and he's just come out with a new book, Children of the Beast, Aleister Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. Now, he just sent me a copy of this book. Oh, boy, it's about 2 inches thick, and there's a chapter on just about everybody in this book that you can imagine. The Beatles, and Jack Parsons, everybody's in here. It's incredible. And I definitely recommend this book. There's a bunch of pictures in here, too, of all these people and different chapters and information. Anselm LaVey and people I've never heard of, too. There's a whole bunch in here. JFC Fuller. I don't know who he is. But it's great stuff by our producer here, William Ramsey. So check out Children of the Beast, Aleister Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. You can find it on Amazon.com, or you could find it in the Opperman Report.com bookstore. We have an urgent bulletin. It seems that the group Strawman is still on the loose. It has been confirmed that Strawman are Canadian, okay, and that authorities are asking people to stay indoors, lock your doors and windows until this group can be dealt with. You could find more information about this group of Canadians, at strawmanmusic.com. you can have your ad played here. Okay, we're looking for sponsors. Okay, in fact, we desperately need sponsors right now to take this show to the next level. So you can have your your ad played here, read live, like I'm doing now, so artfully. Or we can even work up a little jingle for you with some music and stuff like that and play it here. You have no idea how inexpensive it would be to have your ad played on the Opperman Report on 7 stations live Friday night and another 7 stations live on Saturday night, plus replayed every day of the week on different stations, and then archived on YouTube, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and all different kinds of podcasts, Pod this and Podbean, all different kinds of places who archive the show for us. And on those archives, your ad would play indefinitely, forever. You also get a little banner on OppermanReport.com. You get a mention on the air, you get a little interview on the air, and all kinds of fun stuff if you sponsor Opperman Report. We have an opportunity to get this show on a major AM/FM station in California. We've been approved. So if you want to sponsor us into that, so incredibly inexpensive that your ad would be heard by the range covers 5 million people in population where your ad would be broadcast, and all these other stations would be thrown in for free. So really affordable prices to sponsor OppermanReport.com. Get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You can get a copy of that book at emailrevealer.com, or you can get a copy of that book now. It's back up on Amazon.com. How to Become a Successful Private Investigator by Ed Opperman. And this book has been updated a little bit from the previous book that we had that was available to our wonderful listeners. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. Call dropped during the commercial with John Cashill, so I got to pull him back up here so we can get him on the line. Good old John Cashill. Find his website is Cashill.com, and this book, the one we're talking about today, is the latest one, TWA 800, The Crash, The Cover-Up, and The Conspiracy. But like I said, he's got several of these books. If we can't pick them up right away, it's only another half hour. We can reschedule it and just edit it right in. But hopefully he'll pick up unless there's some. Let me take a look and see if he's online. Yeah, it looks like now it says offline. Oh, boy. Hey, let's try him on the phone. Maybe he got sick of me. Hung up. You never know, right? Okay, let's try this. Hey, here we go.
Yeah, I think I seem to have lost my internet connection.
Yeah, okay. I hope that at least you're alive. I was worried about you. I thought maybe I got you.
Right. I'm just sitting here, and then I see the Skype cut out, and then I go to look for your phone number, and I can't get on my own email account. So for whatever reason, I just cut out in the middle here. Okay,
would you have a problem finishing on the phone like this right now?
No.
Okay.
No problem.
A couple of questions for you then, okay?
Sure.
You hear these wild conspiracy theories, and I think this is a wild one, okay? But I like it because since you're like an expert on this, right? Not like an expert, you're definitely an expert. That there was a legitimate assassination attempt on a second plane. There was another plane that was coming behind it, and that's the one that they wanted to take out. What do you think of that one? Did I lose you? Jack? That was weird. The line's still open. Let's try calling him again. That sucks. Because we're running out of time. But the book is TWA 800, The Crash?
Yes, here we are.
Okay, great. So, Jack, I was asking you about kind of a bizarre conspiracy theory.
No, right. I heard that question before. Where something, I think the NSA must be interfering with our communication here. But what happened was this, and here's what gave people reason to think that might have been true, is that the Flight 800 was carrying a load of corneas for transplant purposes to France.
Okay.
And so there's a particular term for, it's like a life flight or something. They get priority. They get to jump the queue. Because of the time-sensitive nature of their containers. And there was an El Al plane in the queue, and they got jumped. So people were thinking that maybe it was an intentional hit aimed at the El Al plane, but that Flight 800 caught it instead. But it's just one of those things. I talked to the pilot who was queued up behind 800. He was a TWA pilot flying to Lisbon. So he explained exactly what happened.
Was there anybody on that El Al plane that would have been worthy of an assassination attempt?
No one on either Flight 800 or the El Al plane deserved his or her own missile, which differs that plane from the one that carried Ron Brown to Croatia. But that's another story for another day.
Oh, I can't wait to get you back on that one, because that's a fascinating story. Ron Brown had a patent on somebody's DNA on a guy in the rainforest. Did you ever hear that?
No.
Oh, it's fascinating. I don't know what the hell's behind that. Okay, what was the story about Pierre Salinger and all this?
Well, it's kind of a bizarre story, but Pierre Salinger, for those who don't remember, was the legendary press secretary to JFK. He was a larger-than-life figure.
Yeah.
And I think he had a French mother or whatever, but he had, we spent a lot of time in France. I met him sometime, I think in the 80s when he was either ambassador. I think he may have been ambassador to France, America's ambassador. He was a U.S. senator for a while. He was a Democrat, big international public relations honcho reporter. Well, about 2 or 3 months after the crash, I know all the principals involved. I've talked to them all. He got wind of the fact that actually his information wasn't wrong. He simply wasn't sophisticated enough to relay it. But like the day or two after the November election, with the Clinton successfully back in the White House, he held a press conference in Cannes, France, and explained that in fact that the U.S. Navy had accidentally shot down the plane, and some of his information was very good. I know his sources. I know how he got the information through a couple of pilots and air traffic controllers. So it was legitimate information. Simply, he wasn't prepared to answer the kind of tough questions that they were willing to ask him. I'm not sure why he went out on a limb like that. I thought, I admire him for doing it. Needless to say, the New York Times and the FBI conspired to just humiliate him. There were 4 articles, headlined articles in the New York Times just in the month of November 1996, questioning Salinger's sanity. Was that moon landing staged in the Houston studio, Pierre? That kind of questions, So it was, but what happened, and I've talked to several people who said, boy, if they could do that to Salinger, what could they do to me? People with information. I've talked to literally scores of whistleblowers, would-be whistleblowers from inside that investigation. Everyone I talked to believes it's cover-up. But they were sobered up by that smackdown of Pierre Salinger. They were sobered into silence, for a whole lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of young kids listen to the show. Salinger was legendary. He was Camelot.
Yes.
Legendary.
Right. No, right. Yeah. To take down Salinger was, it's hard to even think of a comparable figure today, a comparable gravitas who could be pulled down so dramatically and so thoroughly the way they did to Salinger.
And the conclusion that the mainstream press came to was that he was duped by an internet posting,
and that's when they began the, I think they called it, as late as 10 years later, the thing, the Pierre Salinger syndrome. And this goes back to the whole notion of fake news, that, I read it on the internet, it must be true,
Right.
And so the major media, from that day on, even before then, were absolutely trashing any information that was conveyed on the internet, no matter how legitimate it was. What happened with Salinger is that there was a small discussion group of serious aviation professionals who were evaluating the evidence, and they had vowed among themselves not to let this get beyond their group. Well, one guy was indiscreet. The information got out, made its way to French intelligence. They lost 40 of their own citizens, and then it got to Salinger, who was sort of a liaison between the French and American governments, and he went public with it. So.
That's interesting. Did any foreign governments come with a public report, what their conclusion was?
The French were the ones who got closest. I went to a press conference, a small conference in Paris about 10 years ago, met with a bunch of French journalists who had taken an interest in it. Paris Match probably did the best reporting on it. But the French government did not get involved in any significant way. So the story didn't get much more traction there than it did here, although it probably got more traction there, but just not enough to do any good.
Now, there was another, along the same vein of trying to, tarnish people's reputation. I have a friend here in Las Vegas, and she said, Ed, I know this couple. They're involved in this investigation with TWA. They wrote a book. They're great. The guy's an ex-cop. Their name is Jim and Liz. Here's their phone number. Here's their email. They don't return my...
Yeah.
You know who, right. Now...
Oh, I know them well. Sure, they're good friends of mine.
But the official...
And they are... right. I don't want to give... I won't mention their last names. They live in Las Vegas. So you're in... but yeah, everyone knows who they are. It's James and Elizabeth Sanders. James and I collaborated on the first book, First Strike, in 2003. We also collaborated on a video in 2001. I got interested in them because I've met them 4 years after the crash, and when I realized that the government was willing to arrest and convict Elizabeth Sanders especially, she's a real sweetheart, former Polynesian dance instructor, TWA trainer. She was arrested for introducing her husband, who was an investigative reporter, to a 747 manager working investigation. And for that, she was arrested and convicted of conspiracy to steal airplane parts. When I met them, they were both still on probation. I said, boy, these guys are playing hardball. And there's probably more to this story than just some mere, will-o'-the-wisp conspiracy.
Yeah, the official story is that they were beachcombers who were collecting debris and taking it home for their fun as souvenirs. Wasn't that the official story?
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a nutty story. But they were what they got them on. The law that they were arrested on was created to discourage scavengers from coming to the site of an airplane crash. It had nothing to do with reporters looking for information. What happened was that their pilot, their inside source, who was working the investigation, was convinced that there was a whole row of planes, a row of seats, a couple rows, covered with residue from the missile, and he tried to flake it off, and he couldn't flake, so he took a pinch of foam rubber, which contained that material, or that residue, and Sanders had to test it in a private lab, and that's what they arrested them for. It wasn't really stealing parts, it was stealing information, which should have been protected by the First Amendment.
Wait, to clarify for me, they didn't actually take a big giant part or even a small part. They just clipped off a piece of fabric from a chair?
A pinch of foam rubber out of an ocean of pinches. There could have been 1,000 more pinches. It wasn't like they interfered with the investigation, I mean, we're talking like maybe a cubic inch of foam rubber,
Okay, that's a good clarification there. Now, and also, too, Sanders, what's his name? Jim Sanders was an ex-cop.
Ex-cop, yeah, and a traffic investigator, which is how we got involved, which, he was a technical guy with some experience in this. His contact, Terry Stacy, was like the lead 747 pilot for TWA, which is a really prestigious position. And, he was willing to put his whole reputation and his pension on the line to get the truth out. This was, months after the crash, when it was still in the news,
And just think,
and they all were arrested.
How hard is it to arrest an ex-cop in New York? He was a New York cop? Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was a California cop, and he had medically retired after an injury. But, yeah, they got no First Amendment protection at all. The media in New York cheered their conviction. The FBI put out these happy press releases. And Sanders, when he was going through this, was thinking to himself, isn't there someone in the media here who's going to raise a First Amendment issue, But not if the information is counter to the story you're trying to sell.
Right.
You're trying to reelect the president and someone's trying to get in your way. Look what happened to Julian Assange. He used to be a hero, remember? Of the left, up until recently.
Yeah, and we see now with WikiLeaks and stuff like that how much the Clintons control the press. Right. It's outrageous. But how many? They didn't do any actual time, right? But how many years probation did they get?
Well, Jim got 5 and Elizabeth got 3. The only time they did was, in the holding areas and jail cells or whatever. Yeah, they did have to do a perp walk in orange jumpsuits, but they did not go to prison officially.
Amazing.
And what probably stopped them is that it would have called more attention to the case. they could quietly arrest them and silence them. They could let the independent investigators out there, and there's still many out there, very, very good ones, let them know that there was a penalty to be paid for trying to find out the truth there.
Wasn't there something, too, that the flight controller who was actually watching this thing in live time has come forward?
Yeah, he called me or contacted me after my book came out, and I've written about him in subsequent articles. The articles I wrote, he said, yeah, you got it exactly right. He said, and then I've talked to so many people who say the same thing. Listen, I got dependent children. I need this pension, they saw what happened to Salinger. They see no interest from anyone who could protect them, like, say, the New York Times or the government. And so they're very cautious about going public with their information. And when people say to me, why don't more people come forward? Well, why? What's in it for them? They want to tell the truth. These are honest, decent, or, good people. But if all they're going to get from the media and all they're going to get from the government is punishment, it just doesn't. They don't see the return on their investment.
Yeah, that's been like I said, the friends I had that were involved in the recovery. And by the way, now speaking of that recovery, which was pretty unprecedented, I believe, to recover a whole aircraft. Now, they reassembled about 90% of this craft. Am I correct?
Yeah, right. And they did that just as for show and for delay to push the, it was odd because when Clinton met with Taylor Branch about a week or so after the crash in his private interview that would not become public for another 10 years, he talked about how they were going to put the plane together. He said, yeah, that'll probably take them past November. Well, yeah, that was the point.
Okay, that makes sense.
We're still investigating here. We still don't know. We have to be cautious. We don't want to rush to judgment,
Now, was that ever done before or since?
No.
Yeah, right.
Never before, never since.
Now, I was listening to some of your presentations. You said that there were some horror stories about what went on during that reassembly process. Can you give us an idea of that?
Oh, yeah. They were, and this caused a lot of friction especially between the NTSB and the FBI and between the TWA people and the FBI. The union, by the way, I'm not a big fan of unions, but the IAM, the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, was the only entity that put forth a positive and honest report at the end of the investigation, which was included in the final NTSB report that said what blew up his plane originated outside the plane. It wasn't from inside. And they were, of course, silenced. But what they did is they found people actually destroying and manipulating evidence during the course of the investigation, flattening pieces of material so that it looked like the explosion came from inside the plane rather than outside, manipulating the arrangement of the debris field so it would appear that to match the sequence that they had imagined of the nose of the plane just blowing off spontaneously. The whole investigation was skewed from the beginning by really a handful of people in the know, including the CIA people, 2 analysts, their guy inside the NTSB, and I think a few FBI agents who were willing to play along.
Now, what kind of settlements? There must have been lawsuits at the end of this. What kind of settlements were made?
The families, as would be true in just about any domestic plane crash, were compensated. That had the effect of, to be compensated. If it were an act of terror, they wouldn't have been. If it were a military accident, they might not have been. But Boeing fell on its sword, and TWA did too. Boeing was in the middle of a negotiation with McDonnell Douglas. They really didn't have any choice if they wanted this to go through. That merger, by the way, gave them the monopoly on essentially all commercial airplane production in the United States. The same Justice Department, in the same week that they approved the McDonnell Douglas Boeing merger, turned down a merger of Office Depot and Staples, which would have given them 6% control of the pivotal American office supply market. So there's no justice here. Boeing did what they had to do. TWA did what they had to do to survive. They didn't survive much longer. The TWA people are still thoroughly angry about what happened to them and their airplane. And if you saw my presentation on Book TV, you saw that I did it at the TWA Museum. And because I don't know a TWA person who thinks that plane blew up spontaneously.
Yeah, every little puzzle piece fits, and then when you talk about when the settlements do. Now, we're almost out of time. What do you want to leave us with? How can you sum all this up?
Well, I would say this is that the real culprit here, the real scandal is a media scandal. And, governments, as our founding fathers knew when they designed our form of government, are filled with people who can be corrupted, and they were in this case. But what happened in 1996, I'm not sure it's ever happened on this scale in peacetime history before. It's happened during wartime. Is that the media simply chose not to know. And to me, that is the greatest form of fake news. Allowing a false story to be floated because you suspect, you don't even know, you suspect that the truth will subvert your political ambitions. In this case, the ambition to reelect Bill Clinton.
It's terrifying. It really is. And thank God, we didn't get the Clintons again, even though I'm no Trump fan. But thank God.
Honestly. Well, because what happened is just as a final note, I was on a very good documentary came out 3 years ago, just called TWA Flight 800, that I wasn't involved with, but it was very, very well done. And I was on CNN talking about it on one of their morning shows. And the final question, one said, "Okay, Jack, if it was a missile, who shot it? Why did they shoot it? Why did they cover up?" In that tone of voice, I said, "Well, I got a minute left, so let me just say that I said this was Bill Clinton's Benghazi moment. I see he had a national security disaster happen on his watch in an election campaign that he thought he was going to win, and he just kicked that can down the road past November, hoping for the best. And he realized that once you start kicking the can like Obama did, you can't kick it back. It's got to keep going forward." So she said, "Oh, okay, thank you, Jack. Well, next day, I go look at the transcript. My answer has been edited out of the transcript."
Wow.
That's the way they roll. This is fake news, You create a version of news that you like, and God help the person who gets in the way.
Yeah, that famous quote from Clinton, "I'm going to show you what real power is,"
Yeah, right, yeah.
So listen, Jack, I'm going to beg you to come back. I'm going to beg you to come back. What topic do you want to talk about when you come back? Ron Brown, Muhammad Ali, Zimmerman?
I'll tell you what, you pick the topic that interests you most, and we'll go from there, okay?
Jack Cahill, thank you so much.
Hey, Ed, thanks for having me on. It's just Cashill.com. Anyone who's interested, okay?
You got it, brother. Thank you. Cashill.com, and the book that we're talking about right now is TWA 800, The Crash, The Cover-Up, and The Conspiracy. You can find that at OppermanReport.com. It's on our bookstore. But also, too, I know he's a right-wing guy, but I still like him. A lot of WorldNet Daily and stuff like that he writes for. But a lot of good, he covers the stuff that we're interested in. So check out his other books. Ron Brown's Body. That is another book about TWA called First Strike, TWA Flight 800 and the Attack on America. Book about Zimmerman, and you guys know I had a lot of involvement in that Zimmerman case. And my opinions on it don't go along party lines or politically correctness or whatever you might want to call it. So Jack Cashill. By the way, too, a couple of things I want to point out is he had mentioned a source he had in the White House, and he didn't want to disclose what the source's name was. I know who that source is, and I could tell you it's a very, very credible source. The guy came off as a very credible, again, it wasn't politically in my ballpark, but came across very credible to me. One more thing I want to point out. I'm surprised you didn't hear that story about that landing pad thing, because that was everyone told that story. Because it was so funny. He said some guy showed up and he claimed to be with some kind of Army Corps of Engineers or a general or something. He had some kind of credentials, and he demanded they put down this landing pad for the NYPD helicopters. And then they found out the guy had no authority to do anything. But the guys who I know who lifted that debris from the bottom of the water there, and you can see them too. There's a Discovery Channel documentary about these guys, and they talk about it. It's if you just Google NYPD Harbor Aviation Discovery Channel, you find it on YouTube. I know all those guys. And some of these guys were former Navy SEALs, former military, and they said when looking at the debris, because they've seen plane crashes, they've seen missile attacks before, and that the debris they lifted up was definitely a missile attack. And when you hear these different stories, people have different theories. I knew always back in the back of my mind. So it's good to have Jack Cashill here, who you can just tell who he's so familiar with every detail in this topic. If you like this show, go to OppermanReport.com, become a member. A lot of great stuff in the member section will be added in there. So keep in mind, that's what keeps the show going. You become a member at OppermanReport.com. There's other content in there. There's additional shows and a lot of videos and documents and pictures, all kind of great stuff. Thank you.